Hello and welcome to the sewing studio. Today I'm going to show you how to make this quilt block, which some people call diamond in the rough. I've made this using Moda's cider range, and this pattern was very generously shared by a friend called Julie of Kerno Quilters. So today I'm going to show you how to make the block. So there's quite a lot of measurements, so you may want to get yourself a pen and paper before we go any further. So it consists of 2 blocks, and you can make this as big as you want or as small as you want. So you could, if you wanted to, just stop at this block here, which for example is 6.5 inches, and you could use all of those. But these finish up at 12.5 inches, so your quilt goes together much quicker. So my lap quilt here has got 9 blocks. So how do we do this? I'll talk you through. So the first thing you need to make, you need to cut out a 3.5 inch square, which is for this one. Then you're going to cut a 3.25 inch square, and you're going to do that twice. And then you're going to cut it diagonally. So you're going to cut it along here like this. So these pieces are these pieces, these 4 here. Then your next measurement is 2 4.5 inch squares, again cut on the diagonal. So these are my 2 squares cut on the diagonal. So they're the next ones. So they are these ones. And then your next square is 5.5 inches, so 2 squares at 5.5 inches, again cut on the diagonal, and that's these pieces. And then finally, for these big pieces, I have got 2 squares here, and I'll just show you how I'm going to cut them out. So I've got 2 squares here. These measure 7.25 inches, and so I've got 2 like this, and I'm just going to show you how I cut those on the diagonal. And this is what you're obviously doing with all of yours. So you just put your ruler corner to corner. I've got the 2 squares together, and I'm just going to make that cut across there. And then I've got these pieces for the block that I'm going to do. And I'm going to put that all together and show you how that works. For this block, however, all you need is a 6.5 inch square, because when you've finished the first bit of this one, it's 6.5. So if you want one that's just plain, it's 6.5. And then you go to your next measurements of 5.5 and 7.25. So let's put this one together. So we're just going to go over to the machine now, and I'm going to take my first piece. And what I tend to do is I put them in order so I don't get muddled up. So this is my 3.5 inch square. Then these are my 2 squares that were 3.25 cut in half. Then my 2 squares that were 4.5 inches cut diagonally in half. Then my 2 squares at 5.5 cut diagonally in half, and my 2 squares at 7.25 cut diagonally in half. So I put them all in the right order so that I don't get muddled up. And then we're going to go over to the machine, and we are going to do some pressing and cutting as we go. So let's just go over to the machine. So we're going to take our centre square and then our triangles, and we're going to lay them right sides together. And what I'm doing here, you can see that the triangle is bigger than the square. So if I put it under here, you might be able to see closer. You've got these 2 little ears sticking out either side, and you want to try and make sure that these are even. So I'm going to sew that on. And I'm going to do the same the opposite side. So I'm going opposite to opposite at the moment. And again, if I just show you what I mean about these little bits that are slightly bigger, and they're going to be trimmed off in a moment, but you want to make sure that your triangle is central. So we're using 1/4 inch seam as always. And then I'm going to go back to the iron and I'm going to press those and flip them over and trim them. Okay, so we're going to come to the iron. We're going to set our seam. So press the way you've just sewn, set your seam, flip them back. And then we're going to very carefully just trim off these little excess pieces here. So just line your ruler up and a nice clean cut to get rid of those little ears. And then we're going to go back to the machine and we're going to put the next 2 pieces on. So these are now going to go across, right the way across here. So try and sort of line it up as central as you can and turn it over and make sure that you've got your little end pieces roughly the same overhang either side, but there won't be quite as much on this one because you've got the extra 1/4 inch seam that you've turned back. You might want to put a pin in to do this, and the thing to do is not to pull this because it's a triangle now and not a square. It will stretch, so don't pull it across. And do the same on the other side. So again, just make sure that your corners, you've got the same sort of amount overhanging on your corners. Just line that up and sew that. And we're going back to the iron and we're going to press those. So as always, set your seam, flip them back, give it a good press, and now you can see that it's starting to take shape, as in this one here. So I'm going to just line my ruler up and I'm going to trim this bit off here. Don't worry if you've got this on yours, it's perfectly normal. It happens all the time. So you just give it a good trim up, and we're going to square the block anyway. When we've done the 6 inches, we're going to use one of these rulers, which is a 6.5, and I'll show you how to square the block when we get to that point. And the good thing with this is the measurements are quite generous, so it does give you room for trimming if it doesn't all quite line up. And I do like a good slither trim when you've made a slight error with your cutting or your sewing. The thing to do is to just enjoy it and not get too stressed out about it, because it is quite forgiving. So back to the machine for the next one. And you can see why I have them in the right order once I've cut them. So at this point, let me do it under here so you can see it on this camera. I line that up so it's sort of sitting in the V. And then at this point, I do tend to put pins in. As you know, I don't pin things very often, but in this instance, I do pop a pin in. So I'll just do that for both sides. And as I say, I've lined it. If I show you what I mean by that, hopefully you can see it on this camera. So I've popped that in there and you can see that lines up. So I pulled it up and put the pin in. So I'm going to do the same the other way. And then that way you make sure that your point is in the middle. So there shouldn't be too much trimming, she says optimistically. And again, we're going to go back over and press those before we do the next bit. So I'm doing lots of getting up and sitting down, but you may just want to put a cutting mat and a small ironing mat next to your machine just to make life easier, because there is quite a lot of moving around with this. So again, we're just trimming off those corners. And I love this cider range fabric. I love the blues, the mustards, the orange, the brown. They all go so well together. So just line that up. Pop a pin in. Line up the other side and pop a pin in. Back to the ironing board. Now you may remember I said about squaring your block, because this is the point that is that size. So if you look at this one here, this is what we've just made. And we want it the same size as if you were just doing one that was a plain fabric. So it's going to have to finish at 6.5. So these rulers here are really good for that, because they're nice squaring up rulers. So I'm just going to line that up on here to make sure I've got that central. And then I'm going to just go all the way round. And at this point, if you've got a rotating mat, it's perfect, because you haven't got to do what I'm doing now and try and cut with my other hand. I'm just going to come around this way and I'm going to cut from here. Move all our pieces away. Oh, I've just missed this little edge here, so I'm just going to go again. So there is our 6.5 inch block for the centre, As I say, if you wanted to stop and you just wanted blocks this size, that's fine. But I'm going to carry on and I'm going to make it this size. So I'm going to go back to the machine. Go back to the iron. It's really cold in the studio today, so all this up, down and back and forth to the iron is helping to keep me warm. And again, we're just going to trim off these little corner bits. Again, line these two up. So I'm just going to trim these up. And I suppose at this point, if you wanted to do a different size block to the one that I'm explaining, you could even leave it at this size. As long as you did all your blocks the same, it wouldn't matter. If you think this is a good size, you could leave it here. And I think I'll just measure this one for you when I finish trimming it up. But I think this one is probably 8 or 8.5 inches. So if you wanted that size block, then that's a different variety for a quilt if you wanted to do that. You could also sash in between your blocks if that's what you wanted to do. And at the end of this video, I will show you an idea with different colours and some sashing. So that measures 8 inches. So you could stop there if you wanted to, but I'm just going to go back and put the last one on. Because this one's quite big, I'm actually going to pop a pin either end, because with this big triangle you're going to get a bit more stretch. So I'm going to pop another pin on at each end. We're almost there now. It's got 2 more pieces to go on. I know it's unusual to see me pinning things, but I just want to make sure that we don't get too much stretch on those big long pieces. And now we're on the last 2 seams. So back to the iron. Give it a really good press. And we're just going to trim it up. And this should finish up at 12.5 inches. So again, you can always use a 12.5 inch square to square it off, much like we did with the 6.5 earlier on. If you haven't got a square ruler, you can just put it on your mat and very carefully just take a little slither off each side all the way round until you get it to a 12.5-inch square. As long as you make sure you've got your ruler lined up properly, you can manage it without having one of those square rulers, but they are useful if you've got them. Right, there we are. That is your block. So just another idea for you. You could do this same design in monochrome and you could sash it. So I'll just show you what I mean. So I've done some grey blocks. This will eventually be a present for somebody. And I'm sure if she's watching, she knows who. So I'm just going to lay this out and show you. So I've got the big square and then I've got the little squares, and then I'm going to lay it out so the big squares here and the little squares here. And as it grows, it will be another large square there and another small one there. So you're alternating whether you've got your big square or your little square, and you can make it as big as you want. And what you could do is you could have some white strips of fabric, which is what I'm going to do with this one eventually. I'll show you what I mean. So I'm going to sash them with some white fabric in between like this, and again across here like this, and where they meet I'm going to put a black cornerstone. So on every corner there will be a square of black, and you can make the sashing as big as you want, as small as you want. You can put cornerstones in or not, or you can just join all of these up. The choice is yours. So as always, have fun, and I look forward to seeing you next time here in the sewing studio.